to help frame the discussion and provide background to everyone so that we're all on the same page. This presentation should take about 25 minutes, and then after that, the planning board will open the floor for public comment, because what we really want tonight is to hear your thoughts and reactions. We won't be doing a question and answer session per se, but instead we envision more of a listening session we're going to track your questions and comments, and if to the extent that you have questions, we will address them at a future meeting if we don't get to them tonight. The plan for tonight is to wrap up by 9 o'clock with the expectation that there will be another meeting to discuss this further, which we'll get to towards the end of the evening. We have some copies of the presentation up front to share if you want to come grab one. And if you're watching on video, or if afterwards you want more copies, it's all going to be available on the town website, on the planning board's page, under the proposed bylaw amendments section. So helping us with tonight's presentation is our Director of Community Planning, Mary Savage Dunham, and Special Town Counsel for Real Estate and Land Use, Susan Murphy. Thank you for joining us and for helping us to all understand this issue.
The second one was to do with the cannabis thing?
Yeah, so you probably want to take one of
Yeah.
No,
well,
there's
you
two.
just
No, they're the
there's
same.
two
Just some are
handouts.
color and some are black and white, but they're the same thing.
So I get the fancy.
Sure.
Perfect. So let's get to it. I think we're frozen. We'll unfreeze. Well, I'll start because most of you have it in front of you, and at home you'll be able to figure it out. So what will be covered in tonight's presentation? Mary and Susan have been following this issue very closely for the town, and we've worked together to try to determine the right amount of information to present tonight. So what will we cover? First, we'll give you an overview of the Massachusetts laws governing recreational marijuana and marijuana establishments, so that you'll understand from the state perspective what the law is that's been passed. Then we'll move on to the current status of Hingham zoning relative to recreational marijuana. And then what we'll go through is an overview of the actions the town may take relative to regulating recreational marijuana, and an overview of the decisions to be made if the town wishes to regulate the number and/or type of marijuana establishments and the time, place, and manner of the operation of marijuana establishments through one or more zoning amendments. What you will not hear tonight is you won't hear planning board members or town council or Mary giving opinions or deliberating, because that's not where we are. We're just giving you an overview of the facts so that everyone understands what's before us, and then, as I said, we will listen. So that's the focus of tonight's discussion, the public input, hearing from you all, and following this, sending emails or writing letters and letting us know what you think, and then we'll talk about next steps.
So we're going to start out with a little where have we been and where are we now in the form of a timeline. In November 2012, an act for the humanitarian medical use of marijuana, which permitted medical marijuana, was approved in the Commonwealth. 60% of Hingham voters supported this ballot question. As a result of that action, at the 2013 Hingham Annual Town Meeting, voters approved a temporary moratorium on registered marijuana dispensaries, and the reason was to allow time for the Department of Public Health to finish their regulation development process, and so that the town had sufficient time to study the potential impact of the use on the health, safety, and general welfare of the community, and then develop appropriate regulations on the use. Subsequent to that, in 2014, at Hingham Town Meeting, voters then approved a new zoning bylaw regulating registered marijuana dispensaries. And I would note that communities were not permitted to ban that use, so you had to either regulate it or be silent on it. In November 2016, a ballot question on recreational marijuana was approved by a majority of voters in Massachusetts. 57% of Hingham voters voted against the ballot question, and that's important because that makes Hingham a no community. In December 2016, the legislature revised the act in order to delay the implementation, and really that was because, again, they hadn't developed all of their regulations and they needed more time. In April 24, 2017, the Planning Board had proposed and the town meeting adopted a temporary moratorium on recreational marijuana uses through June 30th, 2018. Once again, the Planning Board said, we need more time to understand how this is going to be rolled out, and we think that it makes sense to have a moratorium. July 2017, the legislature passed a more comprehensive revision of many of the provisions of the original act. And where are we now? Now we're approaching December 1, 2017. That's the deadline that the Planning Board has for submission of zoning amendment warrant articles to the Board of Selectmen. Looking into the future, on March 15th of 2018 is the deadline for the Cannabis Control Commission, or the CCC, to promulgate their initial regulations. April 1, 2018, applications for recreational marijuana establishments may be filed with the CCC. We have our next town meeting, April 23, 2018, and then on June 1st, 2018, the CCC will begin issuing licenses.
Okay, so next what we're going to do is just walk briefly through the act. The act is pretty lengthy. A lot of it has to do with details relating to the establishment of the Cannabis Control Commission and technicalities with respect to everything that they are supposed to incorporate into the regulations. But the majority of the act established a new Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 94G, entitled Regulation of the Use and Distribution of Marijuana Not Medically Prescribed. But in the interest of saving words and time, we're calling it recreational marijuana. Oversight is under the Cannabis Control Commission, whose primary responsibilities are promulgating the regulations, which are due under the regulations to be promulgated by March 15th. And the licensing of marijuana establishments, and we're going to get into what is a marijuana establishment in a few minutes. And then local communities have some authority under the Act to regulate recreational marijuana through general bylaws, zoning bylaws, and possibly through health regulations, although it's still an open question pending the CCC regulations how much the local boards of health will be preempted by state regulation. So that's still an open question. On the next page, and I'm not going to read these are out of the Act, and to a certain degree they're even summarized, so some of these definitions are very lengthy, but the words that are commonly used and that we'll be using tonight is marijuana. So that's any parts of the plant, oil and cake made from seeds of the plant, pretty much any substance that comes from the plant itself is considered marijuana, or is defined as marijuana. Marijuana accessories are basically products that are used in conjunction with marijuana. So it does, the accessories don't have any aspect of the plant. They are just, products, devices, materials used in making them, marijuana products, or in the use of marijuana products. They're accessories. And then marijuana products are, I hate to use the word in the definition, but they do it in the state. They're products manufactured from the marijuana plants, the extracts from marijuana. And so for the definition shows, those could include edible products, beverages, ointments, etc. Pretty much anything that you make from the plant but is not just the plant itself. So next, I think you went ahead. So marijuana establishment is really the term that's going to come up the most in the zoning context. And often people think of a marijuana establishment as just the storefront. You walk up to the counter, you buy whatever product you wish to buy. But the way it's defined in the state act is much broader. So it's and these are further defined below, but they include the marijuana cultivator, testing laboratories, product manufacturers, retailers, and any other type of marijuana-related business is considered a marijuana establishment. So, you know, some of the definitions are pretty straightforward. A cultivator, typically people refer to that as growers, but it could also be processing, packaging. The product manufacturer would be a manufacturer that makes, for example, edibles or beverages or ointments. And then the retailer is the establishment that is the typical establishment people think of as you walk into the store to buy the marijuana or the marijuana products. And so these are the terms that will come up most frequently in the zoning context.
And so what is the status of marijuana establishments in Hingham today? As we noted earlier, Hingham is a no community, and that's relevant under the revised act, and we're going to continue to discuss that as we go through this presentation. The temporary moratorium on recreational marijuana establishments adopted at the April 2017 town meeting is in effect through June 30th, 2018. Many communities did adopt temporary moratoria because there were substantial unknowns in the spring of 2017 as to how these marijuana establishments would operate in town and in the state. The revised act that was passed in July 2017 provides more information regarding the licensing of marijuana establishments and did address a number of local concerns. However, it's important to note that the revised act also left a number of important questions unanswered, and the Cannabis Control Commission regulations are still an unknown, leaving Hingham, as well as all other communities, with uncertainties related to the implementation of the act and deadlines by which Hingham must act if it wishes to limit or regulate marijuana establishments.
Okay, so we're going to have a couple of slides that are going to talk about potential actions of the town as a whole, and then we're going to narrow it back down to zoning. But just so that everyone has some context, we're going to start with the bigger picture. And so actions that the town may choose to take include banning or limiting the number or the type of marijuana establishments. And as we just noted, there's 3 or more types of establishments. Regulate the time, place, and manner of the operation of marijuana establishments and of any business dealing in marijuana accessories. So, for example, the town may regulate through zoning the time, place, and manner of the operation of retail shops that don't actually sell any marijuana or marijuana products, but just sell marijuana accessories. A common name for those types of shops are often called head shops or you know, that type of establishment. The town, if the town permits the sale of marijuana within the town, there could be a local sales tax imposed similar to the meals tax that's been adopted in Hingham. The town may consider whether or not to allow on-site consumption. So, for example, you go someplace, you buy it there, and you consume it there. And the town may regulate the use of marijuana in public buildings. This is not an exclusive list, but these are generally the most kind of common topics that are coming up for many communities. So on the next slide, and because of how hard it is to see it on the slide, there's a handouts out up front if anyone didn't get them. The chart that's on the slide is available in big form up front. And as you can see, only part of it is colored, the rest of it's white. That's just to kind of show what we're going to, the planning board's kind of focused on for tonight. This is a flow chart again. It doesn't reflect every possible decision or action the town may take under the act. So for example, there's some representatives of some other departments here. There are some specific provisions in the act that might be of interest to specific departments of the town. I am working on this with our general town council, John Coughlin, who is primarily going to be advising on the non-zoning land use piece of it. So, you know, to the extent there are questions on non-zoning related issues and land use related issues, all of those questions can come in, but I might suggest you want to share them with the planning board and potentially with the town administrator's office if you have questions beyond zoning about how this might work in Hingham. So the chart, just to look at it quickly, you start at the top, the threshold question, does the town want to ban marijuana establishments? If the answer is yes, you look to the left, it's very short, decision tree, a town meeting vote. So you'll see there's a note, and this is where Hingham being a no community comes into play under the revised act. If a town, the majority of the residents of the town voted yes to support the ballot question, then another ballot question would be required in order to ban establishments. Because Hingham was a no community, through December 31st, 2019, Hingham may, if it chose to, elect to ban establishments only through town meeting votes. Another ballot question on a town election wouldn't be required. So this chart applies to Hingham. It's not going to apply to every town. We kind of tailored it to what's specific to Hingham. So that's if the town wanted to ban, town meeting votes, and you're completed. But we're going to take questions at the end, okay? And then, but if the town says, no, we don't want to ban them completely, then as you can see, there's numerous questions and they all have their own kind of decision chain that would have to be followed. Focusing on getting to the yellow, the town could vote not necessarily to ban, but to limit the number, to limit the type and the number. If the town said we're okay with the retailers, but we don't want cultivation or manufacturing, or maybe the reverse. Maybe we want some manufacturing because it's good for business, but we don't want retailers. Like, I'm not saying which the town would want. Those are decisions that the planning board and the voters of the town can make. But then the question is, once the town's determined, do we limit the number, allow however many want to come in? Do we want to regulate beyond that? And so that's when you get into the yellow section, which is if the town says, you know what, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to let the moratorium expire, and this is going to play out. Then, for example, if someone wishes to open a head shop or a retail marijuana product store and they get licensed for that product store by the state, then arguably they could apply to come in to any area where retail is allowed in the town. So whether that be Hingham Square, 3A, 53, Derby Shops, the Shipyard, if there's no regulation, then they could theoretically go anywhere. The same thing with manufacturing. Then manufacturing could be allowed anywhere that manufacturing is allowed in the town. So that's if the town chose to allow the moratorium to expire without enacting any further zoning regulations. If the town wishes to regulate as to time, place, and manner, then zoning amendments will be required. We're going to talk about that in much more detail, and we give some examples. I will note that there's a specific zoning statute that generally exempts agriculture from local zoning requirements. However, the state did revise that section of the Mass General Laws to state that the cultivation of marijuana is not an exempt agricultural use. So therefore, it would require a full zoning process if the town required it in its bylaw. So that's one specific exception from Mass General Laws with respect to zoning uses. So that's kind of just giving you the big picture. And now Mary's going to go into more detail.
Thank you. So I'm going to zip through these slides fairly quickly to get to public comment, but what might recreational marijuana establishment uses look like from a zoning perspective in town if the town chose to not regulate or establish a regulation? First of all, retail. A marijuana retailer is a licensed entity who can sell the product. What types of things might the planning board think about if they were to develop a zoning bylaw about this? They might think about parking demand. Do we have enough parking? Do we need to establish a parking standard for this use? We have been told that we should think about patron management. There might be a high customer volume, so perhaps the lobby or the reception area should be, an increased size. Signage will be important, and buffers. Buffer zones from different uses, perhaps. The planning board of the town may wish to say there's separation distances from schools or daycares, and also screening, and that would be the landscape buffer. So 2 types of buffers. The next example is processing and extraction, and this would be a manufacturer. So again, it could go wherever the bylaw allows manufacturing, unless we regulate it further. And it's important to just call out the fact that the town may want to look at performance standards. Sometimes there can be odors associated with the processing that might be problematic, so that would be something that we would look at in a bylaw if we were to develop one. Cultivation on the large scale is typically done inside, and a cultivator is again licensed, and they're not selling directly to the consumer. They would be selling to another marijuana establishment, a retailer. What types of considerations would we think about within the bylaw possibly? Odors, noise mitigation, building size, again, parking size, and should we incentivize reuse? What if we got a big facility in and it was so specific that it would make it problematic to reuse that site? Are there things that we should be thinking about, not just even for this use, but for other large-scale industrial buildings? Also, demands on the roadway and energy infrastructure. Craft cultivation, this again is cultivation, but it would be on a smaller scale. Is this an accessory use? The zoning or the planning board may want to think about, is this suitable in all zones? Should this be an accessory use in a residential zone? Should it be limited to other types of zones? Delivery, will the business have a delivery function? Will it operate like a pizza delivery facility? Will it be like a taxi service? Should we look at zoning parameters with regard to how many parking spaces we should have, hours, again, regulating time, place, and manner. What are the hours of operation for this use? Should there be some kind of license provision? Now, that wouldn't be planning board. A lot of the things that we are talking about here, I'm trying to focus on just the planning board related comments, and there's many things that aren't in our jurisdiction, but there's a lot of crossover too. So we would not do the licensing. Accessories, again, no marijuana is sold at the store that's called the accessory store unless there's a license allowing that. So accessories are the products that are used in association with marijuana products. The planning board can regulate time, place, and manner of those businesses. So they could take a look at that particular retail use and determine if there should be other parameters about time, manner, and place of use. Signage, depending on what zone a particular use is allowed in, there's corresponding signage regulations. The planning board could take a look at that. These types of uses are regulated just like package stores or alcohol stores. So if the planning board were to take a look at signage for this type of use, it would probably be a broader signage regulation change that would also apply to alcohol stores. On-site consumption, I won't say a lot about this because a lot of it's outside the scope of the planning board, but per the Act, on-site consumption is prohibited unless permitted by an express ballot vote. So if we do nothing, then it's prohibited at this time. Another consideration for the town is special events, and that could be special events on town property or special events elsewhere. And what would that look like? We have some control over some of that in a broad perspective. So after taking a quick stroll through what it might look like, potentially, what actions are needed if Hingham wishes to regulate marijuana establishments? Hingham needs to amend the zoning bylaw by town meeting vote to have regulations in place prior to the expiration of the existing temporary moratorium. And that would mean that we would have to act on something prior to or at town meeting April 23rd. The zoning bylaw amendments should be coordinated with any proposed general bylaw amendments and proposed changes to other town regulations. And our zoning amendments and any proposed changes to Hingham's general bylaws or other town regulations must reference and be consistent with the Act and the Cannabis Control Commission's regulations. However, the deadline for promulgation of the CCC regulations is March 15, 2018, after the town meeting warrant is closed and after the planning board would have drafted their regulations that they could be asking the town to vote on. What type of zoning regulation amendments may be considered by town meeting? A ban on all marijuana establishments, and the Attorney General's office has recommended if you're going to do a ban, that there should be a general bylaw vote as well. The town could choose to ban certain types of establishments. Again, a corresponding general bylaw vote is recommended. The town may opt to limit the number of marijuana establishments and say, you know, we don't, the use is acceptable in town, but we would like to cap it at X number within the town limits. We could regulate the time, place, and manner of the operation of marijuana establishments and of any business dealing in marijuana accessories. Now, a caveat to the regulations can't be what's called unreasonably impracticable. In other words, if you have a regulation that really is so difficult for the business to follow or to generate a profit, that's determined to be unreasonable. Another option for consideration is to adopt a ban at this time and then establish a study committee to bring recommendations back to town boards for consideration at a future town meeting. And this would be then with the benefit of having the Cannabis Control Commission regulations actually written and reviewed. All zoning bylaw provisions would need to be reviewed to determine if it's impacted by a permitted recreational marijuana use. So, for example, what might be changed if the town's moving forward with bylaw amendments? We would want to look at enforcement. The town has the right to impose civil penalties for violations of the regulations. We would want to look at the use table. Specifically, where would the activities fit? What about a delivery-only use? Would that be acceptable? Accessory uses in different zones within towns. What are the permitted uses in accessory buildings? Could craft cultivation be a home occupation, perhaps in a residential zone? We would look at the special conditions to the schedule of uses, and that's an opportunity for the regulations to impose particular conditions to specific uses. And perhaps that might be, you know, the patron management outside of a marijuana establishment. Maybe there's specific parameters for that. Parking, again, what should the parking requirement be? Should delivery trucks be considered? Signage, our medical marijuana regulations should be taken a look at to make sure that they're consistent, and definitions.
Okay, so then the last substantive slide we have here is about timeframe considerations. As you saw in the earlier slide on the timeframes, we have a December 1st deadline for the zoning board and any citizen petition zoning amendments to get submitted to the Board of Selectmen. That's a deadline under the general bylaws of the town and can only be waived by the Board of Selectmen. So December 1's a pretty hard date for zoning amendments. After December 1, the next deadline that's kind of baked in is a March 15th deadline for Cannabis Control Commission initial regulations. Hopefully, there'll be draft regulations that will come out because there's a process for putting out draft regulations, inviting public comment before they're promulgated, et cetera, but no one's sure exactly when that's going to happen. Right now, the Cannabis Control Commission has been having various listening sessions throughout the state where people could write in or show up and just do this, a listening session. They just listen to what everybody's questions or concerns are, but it's unknown at this point when that might result in any actual draft regulations. And then, so that is March 15th. Applications may be submitted to the Cannabis Control Commission starting on April 1st. The Cannabis Control Commission, and I just make a note, there's special provisions that apply if a town already has medical marijuana dispensaries, which Hingham does not. So I'm going to ignore those because they don't apply to Hingham. So for Hingham's purposes, applications can be submitted to the Cannabis Control Commission on April 1st. The Cannabis Control Commission has 90 days to issue a license. They don't have to take the whole 90 days, but they have 90 days. There's a number of factors that have to be satisfied, but then the Hingham Town meeting doesn't happen until April 23rd. So where we are is there's a section of the act that says that the commission shall approve a license if a number of factors are met. One of the factors is that the community where the establishment is proposed has not notified the commission that the proposed establishment is not in compliance with an ordinance or bylaw that's consistent with the statute and in effect at the time of the application. So in English, what that means is, if someone wanted to apply for an establishment in Hingham, and they applied on April 1st, Hingham would be notified of the application. Hingham would have to notify the commission whether or not Hingham believes it has a bylaw that complies with the act and is in effect on April 1st. That would limit or prohibit this establishment from being located in Hingham. I think that's a little more better English, but it's still complicated. So where we are in Hingham is we're a no community. So Hingham doesn't need a ballot vote to limit marijuana establishments, but it would require a town meeting vote. What Hingham has is a moratorium that was duly enacted in April of 2017, which was a zoning amendment adopted by more than a 2/3 vote, approved by the Attorney General, and appears in the Hingham zoning bylaw, and therefore is in effect. There is a question that has been raised at a recent conference of the Mass Municipal Association as to whether or not a moratorium in and of itself would be deemed to be a bylaw in effect at the time, on, say, April 1st, if that's when an application came in effect, that would prohibit or limit the proposed marijuana establishment. And a legal counsel reviewed it. Our analysis is we're no community. It was duly adopted by town meeting. It's a zoning amendment, it's a bylaw, and it's in effect. And it doesn't allow any of these establishments prior to June 30th. But we have to give the asterisks of this is totally untested, no licenses have been applied for, no licenses have been issued, no cannabis control regulations interpreting those sections of the act have come out. And so at this point, if Hingham is acting on April 23rd and someone applied on April 1, the town's position is that to notify the commission that the town has a bylaw in effect consistent with, that would limit it. But it's an open question. So I'm sorry if that was a little bit confusing. But there's a timing question that we had alluded to earlier that has not been fully vetted yet by the state. Jen, you're up.
Okay, so what's next? What's next for tonight is to gain your public input, which I'll get to in a moment. And then before we leave tonight, we're going to schedule future planning board public discussions. One thing I want to address is, why are you hearing from the planning board first on this? And that's because we are up against, as we've mentioned a couple of times, but it bears mentioning again, that we're up against this December 1st deadline by which the planning board needs to submit our zoning warrant articles for consideration for the warrant at town meeting. So that's why we're here, and we want to hear what the public has to say. We want to hear tonight, but we also, and I can say this again, but Mary has business cards here, and on the webpage, on the town webpage, there's a section that says contact me, and if you just select planning board in the drop down and you fill in what you want to let us know, those go directly to Mary. And Mary always gives all of the correspondence to each board member, so we're always very aware of anything you send to Mary, we hear, and that's what we really want. And then, just so you know, number 4, you'll have public input tonight, you'll have public input in the coming weeks, and then we'll have to submit something by December 1st. But then in January, that which we submit by December 1st will be open again for public hearings, and we'll, from there, continue to take public input. So just want to make sure everyone understands this is not the only opportunity to let us know what you're thinking. So, with that being said, let's start. Let me just set a couple ground rules for the public comment. We don't have too many people here tonight, but we don't really want to go past 9 o'clock. So if you could limit your comments to a few minutes, if you would approach the microphone, please state your name and address for the record, and then let us know what you have to say. Please.
Hi, good evening. My name is Lori McCarthy. I live at 143 Otis Street, and I'm here on behalf of Hingham Cares. I'm the co-chair of Hingham Cares, which is Hingham's Prevention Coalition, Substance Abuse Prevention Coalition. And so we are obviously here with the hopes that there will not be a marijuana dispensary in Hingham. On the way over here, I spent the better part of today listening in on the president's meeting of the commission on doing everything they can to, help fund treatment and prevention and support around the opioid epidemic and addiction. And that's the field that I'm mostly sort of an expert in. So I'm not an expert in zoning, but I can offer maybe some words of expertise in the field of substance use. So just to, again, Hingham Cares, we are a prevention coalition. We are committed to the area of prevention of addiction and substance use, and we are committed to educating the town in all of those things that surround that. Marijuana being a substance, we know for a fact that marijuana, people that start using marijuana, there are about 10% of those individuals that will become dependent on that. So it is a mind-altering substance, and it definitely has addictive properties. My co-chair is going to get up and talk a little bit more about statistics, so I will let her do that, and thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Good evening. Kristen Arute, 388 Gardner Street. As Laurie mentioned, I'm co-chair of Hingham Cares, the Substance Misuse Prevention Coalition here in Hingham. She did a nice job talking about her experience professionally as an addiction counselor, and I have some statistics that I'd like to share. So we offer a unique perspective, being the Substance Misuse Prevention Coalition here in town. We've been working very closely with SAD at Hingham High School. Tom Ford is the SAD advisor, Officer Ford with the Hingham Police Department. And so we're coming at this from the perspective of what type of message do we want to send to the youth in our town. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration is the agency within the Department of Health and Human Services that leads public health efforts to advance the behavioral health of the nation. Its mission is to reduce the impact of substance abuse and mental illness on America's communities. Every year, a survey of substance use prevention issues and the initiation of substance use is conducted with a civilian, non-institutionalized population of the United States aged 12 years old and older. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health is a face-to-face household interview survey that is conducted in 2 phases. In 2016, these screenings included 17,109 interviews with adolescents aged 12 to 17. On behalf of Hingham Cares, I would like to share some of their findings. In 2016, an estimated 1.2 million adolescents aged 12 to 17 said that they used marijuana for the first time within the past year. This translates to approximately 3,300 adolescents per day. Almost half of adolescents aged 12 to 17 reported that it would be fairly easy or very easy for them to get marijuana if they wanted some. Adolescents' perceptions of the level of parental disapproval of youth substance use have been associated with the initiation of substance use and with substance use in general. Most adolescents in 2016 believed that their parents would strongly disapprove of them trying or using marijuana, drinking alcohol, or smoking cigarettes. However, while the percentage of youths who believed that their parents would strongly disapprove of cigarette smoking and alcohol use increased between 2002 and 2016, the percentage of adolescents who believed that their parents would disapprove of them trying or using marijuana decreased. During this same time period, perception of great risk from smoking marijuana once or twice a week decreased by 27% among 12 to 17-year-old adolescents. Conversely, during 2002 to 2014, the percentage of adolescents perceiving no risk from smoking marijuana once or twice a week almost tripled. The report concludes that because of increases in perception of no risk from smoking marijuana, increases in past month marijuana use among adults, and state-level law and policy changes, further attention to marijuana use among youth and abuse and dependence among adults is warranted. Substance use, as Lori mentioned, as we all know, is a major public health problem in the United States. Risk factors are typically associated with an increased likelihood of substance use, and protective factors are typically associated with a decreased likelihood of substance use. So naturally, efforts to prevent substance use generally aim to reduce the influence of risk factors and to enhance the effectiveness of protective factors. Because multiple studies have found associations between early initiation of alcohol or drug use and an increased likelihood of developing substance use disorders, one major goal of substance use prevention programs, such as Hingham Cares, is to prevent or delay the initiation of substance use. This is accomplished through reducing the influence of risk factors like availability, that's considered a risk factor, and enhancing the effectiveness of protective factors like prevention messaging. Community is listed as a domain of influence on these variables. What better messaging could we as a community use to signal support for substance use prevention efforts with our kids than to ensure that marijuana remains less accessible to them? I also just wanted to point out that of the local abutting communities to Hingham, Hull and Rockland are 2 communities that have voted in favor of recreational marijuana. In 2016, Quincy is also one. Every other community locally, Norwell, Hanover, Cohasset, Duxbury, Marshfield, all voted against question 4, so that's worth noting. I had conversations with Phil Lemnios, the town manager of Hull, and Pete Moran, the town administrator of Norwell. Hull voted in favor of recreational marijuana, and Mr. Lemnios told me that the town is currently exploring all of its options. The Hull Planning Board will be drafting a zoning bylaw article that will then go through the hearing process. He said it's premature to say whether or not it will be brought before town meeting in the spring. He also mentioned the date of April 1st as being a very important and pivotal date as well. There's a special town, he suggested that a special town meeting might be in order. In an effort to educate the public, Hull created a task force, and they're holding a series of seminars, one per month for 4 months, beginning in January. And that's being spearheaded by Selectman Domenico Sestito. I believe he's also working in conjunction with HAPSA, which is the Substance Misuse Prevention Coalition in Hull. When I spoke with Pete Moran of Norwell, he said that Norwell has already followed all of the steps provided by the Massachusetts Association of Town Solicitors. That was provided in March. And the actions that Norwell has taken have been approved by the Attorney General's office. They passed a moratorium, brought a general bylaw and a zoning bylaw before town meeting last spring. Because the town voted against legalizing marijuana, the selectmen he said the selectmen could have voted on a ban, however, they chose to go the extra step with a referendum. The town voted against recreational marijuana, but in favor of the sale for medical use, and they have approved sales and cultivation by one business in that overlay district. So, thank you for allowing me to take so much of your time. Hingham Care stands with the residents of the town of Hingham. In 2016, the voters voted to oppose recreational retail marijuana. For this and the aforementioned reasons, we believe that retail marijuana has no place in our town. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who would like to speak? Thank you.
My name is Bill Fortune. I'm at 12 Newbridge Street. First off, I would like to thank Hingham Cares. As an athlete myself, I went through major knee surgeries throughout my entire career, and I personally was on opioids after my surgery. And through programs from my own hometown, Hingham Care, such as Hingham Care, I have recovered from addictions to those. To talk about statistics with addictions, though, and substance abuse, alcohol addiction has killed over 88,000 people a year in our country. Legal drugs, such as ibuprofen, which I currently am on almost every day because of my knee pains, kill over 100,000 people a year. Tobacco kills over 400,000 people a year. Cannabis kills 0 people over the year. Even though I do agree that it is an addictive drug, it is not a lethal drug. I am in favor for retail in the town of Hingham. It is a great opportunity for the town to provide another source of income for us. It is also an opportunity for people such as myself to not be exposed to opioids or alcoholism or anything like that to comfort my pain that I have to go through on a daily basis. I do have been on CBDs for my knees, and since I have been for the past year, I have been more active and actually now playing sports again because I am capable of being in a comfort zone that I can actually be active. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Sir, go ahead, in the back.
Wait a moment. I gotta figure out how to use one of these things.
Yeah.
We've seen you do this a couple times.
Anybody who should know how to use it.
I'm a slow learner. Must be the weed. First off, my name is Barnard Phage, 100 Wampatuck Road. Question 1. it says, note to majority, voters disapproved the state ballot question, therefore town meeting may ban MEs. But after December 1st, a ban will require a ballot vote. Is the ballot vote a ballot vote at town meeting, or is the ballot vote at the actual ballot box when we elect people?
So after December 31st, 2019, the town would have to have a ballot vote, and it would actually have to be on a ballot at a town election, not town meeting.
Okay. And at that time, that is, the question is on the ballot can be crafted not by you folks, but by the people within the town, correct? In other words, people can get it on the actual ballot. As a
I
binding.
think, you know what, we didn't really kind of come to prepared with the detailed questions, so rather than potentially give you an inaccurate answer, what I'm going to do is take down all the questions, and then we'll follow up with answers.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, even though there are plenty of them here. All right, that's number one. Number two, I'd like to say that, with all due respect to these ladies here, I question every single bit of the reefer madness that they're, in my opinion, promoting. Their statistics are wrong. Their statistics are junk science. As a matter of fact, I believe your statistics, if you invented a new way of being wrong, you couldn't even be more wrong. That's number two. Most people, even though this is being called a no town, most people, and if you've looked at the latest surveys, most people are now, even a lot of conservatives, are now in favor of recreational cannabis. Do your own checking. You people are representing us. I mean, don't.
Yep, that's why we're here.
Okay.
Yep.
As far as the addiction thing, I do not believe cannabis is addictive. I'm not a big user of cannabis, and right off the bat, I'll tell you right up front, I have absolutely no desire, no use for any kind of commercialization profit motive. In other words, I have no interest in getting in it. This is, to me, it's an issue of freedom, and this is an issue of the reefer madness people, I call them the cannabisionists, trying to micromanage what the people want, and I believe if we took a vote right now with the general public would support it in this town. Things have changed. The government is way behind the people when it comes to this. I had a father who was blind. One of my biggest regrets is I didn't get my dad, he didn't get to use cannabis. And I've seen all the great things it does. I mean, the phenomenal things. The death rates go down about 30%. Whenever there's opioids, whenever there is legal cannabis, the opioid deaths go down. So all the addiction experts, all the people in what I call the anti-cannabis gravy train, which is corporate law enforcement, the pharmaceutical industry, the liquor industry, and the recovery industry, they don't want to deal with this reality. The reality of it is, when there is cannabis around, people use it for pain. People can use it recreationally. I'm not quite sure in what's going on here as far as actual establishments where people are going to be using, cannabis at a restaurant or whatever. I think that's something that we still are going to have to wait for law enforcement to actually come up with what is an impaired level, and then take it from there. But I think that trying to turn this into a no town is not only absurd, and it's not a question, in my opinion, it's not a question of economics. It's a question of giving people a product that they can buy, that they know exactly what it is, the same way they can do with beer, wine, alcohol. It's something that I do not think that we should put, and we've already had a vote, a statewide ballot, which was micromanaged by the legislature, and now I do not think it is wise to put it in the hands, to control of it in the hands of a few people. It's that simple. If we put it on the ballot, and it's a nicely worded question, and most people want it to be regulated the same way as alcohol. And I have to say, as somebody who's been a proponent of cannabis, it is insulting when I hear, and anybody else I believe who uses cannabis, it's insulting to hear people imply that we are going to give or allow children with forming brains to have cannabis. It's just not going to happen. So this is another one of the things the reefer madness people are promoting, and it just makes no sense. So I'm trying to think of what else. I mean, I had a whole bunch of stuff. And if you folks are trying to regulate it into a combat zone, it will be called the combat zone. I don't know if you folks remember the combat zone. Okay, so that's what you're trying to do. And there is a stigma that some people are trying to put on cannabis users, like we're some sort of second-class citizens.
Well, and just to be clear, we're not trying to.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm looking at you, first because you're attractive, and second because you're You're the center of the focus.
All right. Do you have it- Are you getting to the end here?
Almost. All right, let's see. We got the latest surveys, the stigma, the combat zone. If we have an area where people can buy cannabis, they know the quality. They know exactly what they're getting beforehand. Let's see. What else did I have here? On-site consumption. Established the overdoses. Well, I have a lot more, but I kind of can't read my own writing sometimes here. But I will take issue with these statistics that are basically, these are the same kind of statistics that have kept the cannabis illegal for 70 or 80 years. And if you look at all the original studies that were done, the LaGuardia studies, it is far more safe than alcohol. We know what tobacco does. And as far as addiction, I mean, it breaks the opioid addiction. So with that, thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I'd just like to clarify for the record. So the term no community, yes community is just kind of shorthand that the state, people in the state have come up to describe a certain point in time, which was the November 2016 election, where either a city or a town, the majority voted in favor of the ballot question, in which case they were termed yes communities, or against the ballot question, in which case they were called no communities. So it's just a snapshot at a point in time in the November 2016 election, and so no one's trying to turn the town particularly into a yes or a no. It's just because that's the way the town voted on that date and time, the law, the steps the town would follow would be different than if it had voted differently. So that's, I just want to clarify what
Thank you.
that
Yeah, that's
term
important.
means.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Go ahead. Oh, do you want to go? Go ahead.
Good evening.
I'm honored, you got to put the microphone back now.
Well, I didn't come intending to speak tonight. My name is Dorothy Gallo. I live at 1 Volunteer Road in Hingham, and I'm the superintendent of schools. So I didn't come here tonight to argue one way or another about the safety of marijuana or whether or not it's a precursor of other kinds of addictions. In fact, I didn't come here intending to speak at all. But I think you've heard two extreme views here, and mine is probably further to the right than the one that you heard with the two beginning speakers. Because as a long-term educator, my main concern is about the increased access to marijuana that students and maybe even children younger than students would have if we had such establishments in our town. And I feel the same way about alcohol. Other kinds of drugs and other things are prohibited. And for me, these are all prohibited to children, and anything that allows children, students, to have greater access than they already do, which is a lot of access. Some of the statistics that were quoted about marijuana use among our students are pretty high, even though we don't have those establishments nearby. So I believe that people have rights. I also believe that we don't, as citizens, need to exercise everything that we have a right to do. And that my thinking, as, again, a long-term educator, is there may be times when we need to, as adults, set examples to be willing to forgo some of our rights so that we can benefit kids. So that's apart from the fact that marijuana is illegal for students. And simply all of this talk and the ballot vote itself and the different votes that have been taken in different communities that were in the press have in fact, and I won't give an example of that for confidentiality reasons, but we have students who think they hear recreational marijuana is okay. And they're kids. They don't always think with the front of their brain. They're kids. And kids are often influenced, well, it's okay for me, it will only be a misdemeanor or whatever. Point is, it's illegal. Drinking's illegal for students. Other drug use is illegal for students. And I feel very, very strongly that what we need to do is set examples for our kids of obeying the law being one, not just whether or not drugs and substance abuse is okay and a precursor to something else. So I have to respectfully disagree with the previous speaker, who is someone I've known for a long, long time, and say I would oppose anything that gives greater access to, whether it's alcohol or marijuana or anything else, to our students. Many years ago, in the 70s, I was an assistant principal at the high school. And those were the years when alcohol was legal at age 18 and not 21. Those were the years we had smoking areas in high schools. Everybody did. You know, things that we don't even think of doing now. I certainly don't want to go backwards to those years when marijuana use in this town and most towns among teenagers was a lot higher than it is today. My big concern is that many of the students that were graduating from high school and college in those days and who were marijuana users, you know, are our parents of today. So I also look not just at the modeling of what the community is saying, even when we talk about something where we use recreation and marijuana in the same context and sentence. And I know you've just called it recreational because it's not medical, but what are we modeling for kids about obeying the law, about protecting their health, and about their precious futures? So I'd say consider that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hello, good evening. That's very short.
Yeah.
Hi, Diane DiNapoli, 16 Gardner Street. Here, little background, I was the co-chair of the CPAC for 2 years, the former teacher, and I'm currently on the board of SNAP, as well as a member of Hingham Cares. But most importantly, tonight I'm here as a mom. I have 2 children who are at high risk, and I'm deeply concerned about the blurred lines and the false information that the developing marijuana industry is promoting. Hingham should be promoting facts and drug prevention and education about marijuana. I took the liberty of finding some facts. This is reality, if we're calling it that, from the CDC site today. And here are some known risks that, again, this is from the CDC website. I do not consider this reefer madness. That prolonged marijuana use creates breathing problems, short-term memory attention issues, learning difficulties, increased risks of mental illness such as schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety. These are the known facts. To the speaker before who said that it's insulting to think that people would allow their children to have access to marijuana or edibles, I think if we only look at what happened in Plymouth this spring when a 3rd grader brought in marijuana brownies for his fellow students. I think if that's not eye-opening, we have to really consider what children are getting their hands on. These are the known factors. And one thing, again, for emphasis on how important this is, people who begin using marijuana under the age of 18 are at 1 in 6 risk of being lifelong addicts. Some of the great unknowns that I think we've discussed tonight are currently there is no way for police to, if someone is pulled over for an OUI, to know if they are using marijuana. It's unclear if or how we will comply with federal laws. As we know, it's still illegal on a federal to have marijuana in the federal laws. Long-term effects of higher-based THC products, such as oils and edibles, are unknown. I implore you here in Hingham to really, again, promote education, promote the facts, and promote a conversation. I think the idea to adopt a ban and to establish a study committee is an excellent one because these are very complex issues, and I think we have to allow time for the entire community to think about these issues and make a prudent decision. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
Sir, yes.
Good evening, and thank you for doing this. Jim Watson, 291 Rockland Street. I think I have a very simplistic response to this. Here we have a substance which is apparently less fatal than alcohol and addictive as other things are, a substance which is regulated and perhaps should be regulated more, which should not be available to kids any more than alcohol or tobacco is. But with enough regulation on who sells it to whom, under what conditions, what you have is a retail business. And I'm puzzled that the page on zoning issues talking about uses mentions processing, extraction, cultivation, accessories, nothing about retail. But the most common use, I would think, would be retail sales. And my guess is that if the information we get about not being fatal, about fewer opioid deaths in communities that have recreational use, I've got that off billboards, so that's not very, it's hard to attribute that, but I've heard people arguing that. I think we should back off a little bit and say, okay, regulate it carefully, particularly among kids, and then have information so people know what they're getting into. And as we do, we didn't used to know that about cigarettes. Remember all the doctors smoking cigarettes, the T-zone? I mean, there's been a real lag in information on a lot of fronts because of corporate influence and whatnot. Here we have something which is more of a ground-up interest. And, well, I'm repeating myself, but the main thing is I think these uses should be treated like other manufacturing and processing and retail uses. And whether you can buy some grass in a package store or a separate little store, if the conditions are the same and it's regulated the same way, trust people. I mean, people will do stupid things. I think we've all done stupid things on occasion. I never inhaled, to tell you the truth, but still, you have opportunities and you have choices. And I would treat it in terms of land use planning as a retail use and the others to be allowed where similar activities are allowed under the same degree of regulation, particularly as package stores, pharmacies, and any place that sells cigarettes. And we worry a lot about proximity, but there are package stores near schools, and you don't see 10-year-olds going in to buy a nip, because they can't, and I think proximity is overstated. If the people selling are conscientious, and some people will use bad judgment. But basically, I think you have a pretty straightforward land use regulation issue, and not a moral issue. You don't want to encourage something self-destructive, but you don't want to deny alternatives. It's contradictory. You don't want to deny alternatives to figure out what you want to do with yourself. And maybe we let people take a risk, but we've already, since Prohibition ended, we've let them take that risk with some pretty bad results in many cases. But we seem to tolerate that. And so I think I wish you luck in doing this equitably. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jim.
Who else would like to speak?
Rob Ramsey, 4 Russell Pond Road, Kingston. I'm actually the town's DARE officer. Just to reiterate, Dr. Gallo just pretty much stole my thunder. Kids today feel that this drug is no big deal. The marijuana industry is pretty much taking a textbook out of the tobacco industry from 50, 60 years ago, and they're pushing it right on kids, and that's what scares me. I know some marijuana abuse for some medical issues, but to set up pot shop up here in Hingham, I think sends the absolute wrong message to the kids in town. It will make it more easy for them to get a hold of, and that's what concerns me more than anything else. I just like to put my 2 cents in, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chief.
Good evening. I think as the chief of police, you probably can pretty much understand where my points come from on this. And, I'm definitely have grave concerns about the whole passage of the marijuana law. But I also understand that that's the rule of the land. But I think, as I've thought a lot about this, I think some of the and people have been talking about some of the drawbacks, the enforcement issues. But I sort of was thinking on a far greater scale here. And often the town of Hingham has a long history, historic history of hundreds of years of managing itself in a conservative way through zoning, bylaws, and everything else, and it's created a unique character. I don't know how many times I've come to these meetings, far too many times, and as all we talk about is the character of Hingham. The character of Hingham sits largely on this board and other boards in the town of Hingham as they move through some of these things. We don't have fast food restaurants. Why? We don't have other things, and these are decisions that are made by these boards to control the image and the character of Hingham, because everybody comes to Hingham because they want to be here. There's great schools, there's great harbor facilities, there's great sporting events. You have an efficiently run government that thoughtfully thinks out things, that has a AAA bond rating. You know, we're at that peak. We're a desirable town to come from, and part of what we have to consider is how is our zoning of the commercial and retail sales of marijuana going to fit into that schedule? And what is that impact to the town? If we mismanage this, what is that going to cost? I mean, I think we're very carefully about all these other building projects that go into town. And we don't very often make a lot of mistakes about the different issues. I mean, and I think this is something, as the zoning board moves through this, they have to really consider that message that we send to the community, namely the children out there. Right now, we're in a state for the past 4 or 5 years of fighting an epidemic with opioids. You know, for years, I'm not going to say that marijuana was a gateway drug, but all I can tell you is every person that I've had conversation with, every person I've met, every person I've talked to that has a substance abuse disorder, addicted to a drug, has started at some point with marijuana. Now, we all know that it's not safe. If you smoke a joint, you're going to be a heroin addict. That's not true. But there's addiction problems out there. We don't really fully understand yet. There's not a lot of data out there yet on the products that are being sold there. We often hear some talk about we have experience because in the 70s we smoked marijuana. It's not the same products out there. You're not allowed to smoke marijuana in public. But what about eating marijuana in public? The consumption of it in baked products and goods. How do we regulate that? And how are you as a board and the members in Hingham going to regulate anything when the state regulations haven't even been completed? You know, I just think it's foolish to sort of put ourselves in a spot that we're going to make a judgment on what to do without knowing what the rules are first. I wouldn't go and take a house loan just on the basis of, yeah, I'm going to get a loan. Just tell me what it's going to be later. That's not wise business. That's not the way to run your town. I'm totally in favor of, you know, opposing or continuing to put a ban on this as long as we can until we have the chance to get the regulations out, review them, see what other data is coming out from areas like Colorado. It's not really, you know, it's not stopping the black market and the illegal stuff that's still going on. That's going to continue no matter what happens. So this isn't the miracle cure to stop that. So I would strongly urge that we continue the ban on this as long as possible, let the data come in and wait for the regulations to come in. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me make sure there's no one else before I go back to you. Yeah, please. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Hi, John Leonard, 600 Main Street. We've come a long way since 1977, since at that time a Hinghamtown employee was interviewed in the Patriot Ledger in support of legalized marijuana and was promptly fired. And there was only 15% back at that time for legalization. So we've certainly changed along 40 years later. Marijuana's been on the ballot 5 times in Hingham. twice binding and non-binding for medical marijuana, binding and non-binding for decriminalization. It passed 4 times. This last time, for full legalization, it did fail by 42%. But we should look at the experience of Washington State. It won in Washington State in 2012. 56% of the people supported legalized marijuana. It passed there. Since that time, in the last 4 years, support has grown to 78%, 22% increase in support in their 4 years of experience with legalized marijuana. If we look forward to 2020, if we extrapolate those results from Washington State, that says 64% of the people in Hingham will support legalized marijuana. A brief comment about marijuana. The history goes back in the 30s. There was a lot of sensationalized fear-mongering going on. Marijuana was primarily used by non-white people, by black people, by Mexicans. There was a lot of racial-based fears that the Hearst newspapers stirred up. Alcohol is a much more dangerous drug. My father was, the night before he was going to be in the Senior Olympics, he was hit by a drunk driver, and he died a few months later from complications. It's just a mini. Dot Gallo and I were both. I was in high school in the mid-'70s when she was a math teacher there. Growing up, many people died from alcohol accidents, alcohol-involved auto accidents. It's a much more dangerous drug, but we should look back to the political reasons why marijuana was made illegal. My talk was primarily on the tax, what would happen with the taxes in Massachusetts, in Hingham, if we allowed marijuana dispensaries in Massachusetts. In 2015, the state legislative report chaired by Jason Lewis said that 900,000 people in Massachusetts got their marijuana on the black market, and that extrapolates to just over 3,000 people in Hingham would have been buying black market marijuana. So this is not a new. This is already. It's not like people are going to start buying marijuana. They're already doing it. So it's just a question of, do we want to collect tax money from this? Colorado brought in $1.3 billion in 2016, and $875 million of that was in adult recreational sales. If we extrapolated that to the population of Massachusetts, that's over $1 billion. And that, if we extrapolated that experience to Hingham, that's over $3.6 million gross revenue in Hingham. That would translate to $219,000 in taxes in Hingham. It's my thing's footnoted. We would be bringing in 6% tax, 3% in tax, and 3% from the hosting agreement. So that's a lot of money. That's approaching $250,000 in taxes. My paper's focused on taxes, but I wanted to say a couple things. Opium was brought up, and there's a billboard in Weymouth talking about 25% reduction in opioid deaths where marijuana is legalized. I was reviewing paperwork, doing research today, and I saw one study that said 33% reduction in opioid deaths due to legalized marijuana. In my personal sphere, I have 2 friends that have legal opioid prescriptions. One of them has been able to cut out the pills entirely because of her marijuana use, and another friend has been able to cut down his use substantially of the legal pills there. So I think it's a good way to combat the opium problem. Anyways, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay. Does anyone else want to speak? I haven't forgotten about you. I'm just making sure. Okay. Go ahead.
Me again. Bonnet Phage, 100 Wampatuck Road, Hingham. I'd like to speak to a couple of things. First of all, some of you are old enough to remember, probably really young, but there was a time when the drinking age was lowered to 18. Anybody remember that? Turned out to be an abysmal disaster. The public reacted, it was brought up to 21. If cannabis legalization is as much of a disaster as the reefer madness people, as the people who are the Chicken Little, the sky is falling people say.
Anna, can I just, I mean, everybody's here in
Okay,
good
I'm sorry.
faith.
Then maybe
So
I'm
if you,
just-
they're being respectful of your opinions, I would just ask
People who
that you.
I believe are either malignantly misinformed or benignly misinformed. You have to respect a plant that has, for the last 80 years, has had hundreds of billions of dollars thrown at it to keep it illegal, and yet it still pops up. Every time it's put in front of the voters want cannabis. Singling out a brownie in a town as a reason to change the entire direction of any town is just absurd. Thinking that we as adults are going to give it to children, with all due respect to...
Can you direct your comments to me, please?
Okay, well, no, I was,
Thank you.
okay. It is, nobody is even coming close to supporting giving cannabis or any of the derivatives without a prescription to a forming brain. The message we are sending to our children is that, I mean, and it's been the last 80 years, it's children are going, the ones who want to find a way to alter their consciousness, they are going to do it. Now these kids can go online, they can get seeds, they can get lights. I mean, we're not going to keep it away from the children. The best thing we can do is at least find a way to slow the black market so these children are not exposed to dealers who have all kinds of other things besides cannabis, the people who are going to push opioids on them. Now, I mean, apparently they're now finally realizing that a lot of the opioid addiction was not started by cannabis. It was started by painkillers from doctors. And somebody, you know, people saying that they all started with cannabis is like saying, you know, I'm overweight because I started with donuts. I mean, people are responsible. Adults can make their own decisions. And this is commerce. And allowing and keeping it on par with alcohol is probably the best thing that we can do. And we're also facing tens of thousands of tech-savvy people who are now mobilizing as they did in Question 4. And I, for one, believe that if we redid Question 4 today, it would pass with a far greater margin because of the way the legislature decided it wanted to undo the will of the people. That's just my opinion. But I would just, whenever we hear facts, I would suggest that the people on this board do your own research. Look at what's happening in Colorado. The world, you know, hasn't ended. The sky hasn't fallen. Look at the death rates due to opioid overdoses as they drop down, and a lot of the other things, the good things that cannabis does, as opposed to, you really feel bad for people who have addictive issues. But the addictive issues are really not related to cannabis. So, okay, thank you.
Yes.
Judy Kelly, 19 Harvest Lane. I just, as soon as the individual spoke about the dispensaries brought in $1.3 billion in gross sales in 2016, I don't think we can even consider that without having the alternative to what was the increase in the cost to police and such services that the state of Colorado had to pay out. We're just talking about what has been brought in. We also don't have any results on deaths or related health costs due to accidents or anything else that's in there. So you just can't look at your taxes without doing the other side of the coin and what are going to be the negative effects that are on there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Judy.
Yes, go ahead.
Lori McCarthy, 143 Otis Street. I just want to add, finally, take a look at 60 Minutes. They did a segment a few months ago. It was before the election on Colorado and what's happening since the legalization of marijuana. And the parting comment that the governor of Colorado had was they asked, what is your advice to other states that have this question on the ballot? And the governor's response to that was, wait. We don't have all of the data yet. We don't really know, he cited a lot of negative things that were happening in the state as a result of it. But his advice to wait a couple years, wait until we have more data, wait until we're better informed on, what's the impact on the youth, what's the impact on health, what's the impact on drug driving, like whatever the issues are. So, I would encourage you all to take a look at that segment again. And I'm happy to share the data that I quoted is all from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So I'm happy to get that, those footnotes and back up
Yeah,
to
if you
you.
submit, whatever you submit to Mary
Okay.
will get to us.
All right, will do. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to speak? Okay.
I have a question. if that's all
Yeah,
right.
sure.
So, looking at the chart here, which I appreciate Susan and Mary working on, thank you very much. So, my first question is that obviously zoning amendments require a 2/3 vote at town meeting. Looking at your chart here under the years column, action, TM, vote, would that be a majority or a 2/3 vote?
So, zoning's always a 2/3 vote.
Zoning
And
is,
general
right.
bylaws are always a majority
Majority,
vote.
right.
At this point, because of the unknowns, the Mass Municipal Association is hesitant to say, if you just do A and not B, you're fine, because we don't have the final regulations, we don't know how they're going to be interpreted. The way I look at it is, if you pass a zoning amendment, and you have 2/3, then, it's not going to be that difficult to get the majority for the general vote, but you might be able to pass a general bylaw with a majority and not get the 2/3. So it's kind of a belt and suspenders recommended approach. But I'd say if you can get, for any of this, whether it's just a zoning amendment or whatever, there's lots of recommendations where they're saying, well, do belt and suspenders. If you can get a 2/3 vote for a zoning amendment that does X, then presumably you can get a majority vote for the same thing. So I think the bar is, as it always is the zoning. If you amend the zoning in any way, ban, limit, regulate, that's always the tougher bar at town meeting.
So I guess my follow-up question is, why would we do the zoning amendment before the general bylaw question is answered? Wouldn't it make sense to do the general bylaw question first and then address zoning?
Well, again, the zoning amendment is the higher bar.
Sure.
So even if you got the same 57%, now granted, there were over 14,000 voters in the November 2016 election, we would not fit that many people in the high school for a town meeting. We usually have anywhere, depending on the town meeting, 300, maybe a big town meeting has 1,000 people. So you're probably looking at more 400 or 500 people at a typical town meeting. And so the question is, if you only get the same 57%, the zoning amendment's not going to pass, so the general bylaw might not be sufficient in and of itself. So, Bill, I wish I could give you a more definitive answer, but the real answer right now is, until we have more definitive regulations, it's unclear which type of vote. So the bylaw just says it has to be by a town bylaw or an ordinance. It doesn't say what kind of town bylaw or ordinance. And so if you go for the town meeting vote and it comes down that, no, this is a use that's properly regulated by zoning and you didn't get the zoning amendment, it might not be sufficient. So, I think that, you are the planning board, you're kind of, your purview is to recommend zoning amendments, that the planning board decide what type of zoning amendments it wants. Obviously, a general bylaw can come from anyone, it can come from other boards in town hall, it can come from citizen petitions, but at the end of the day, the zoning amendment's going to be the higher bar, and I would say if the town was looking for a use regulation of any scope, that I would not recommend the town only do general bylaws and not do zoning. I wouldn't recommend that. It's not being recommended by Mass Municipal Association, the Mass Municipal Lawyers Association, the AG's office, myself, or John Coughlin, the town council. Our recommendation is that the town do something through zoning if it wishes to regulate and not just have the moratorium expire.
I had a question, too. I have a question relative to, this chart governs the, or states the two potential critical path flows for recreational marijuana in a community. However, there's the other regulations that are covered under the Act for the medical marijuana, and these clearly are not addressing those. I'm trying to, could you just give an overview of where the statute is relative to the medical use of marijuana, and is that a humanitarian use? And what are the regulations and what are the controls in place for that that are already passed by the state?
Right. So the medical marijuana was passed, as Mary outlined in her timeline, in 2012. Hingham Town Meeting adopted a zoning bylaw that governs what's referred to as registered marijuana dispensaries. So that is currently in place. There's very little in the act that was passed in 2016, 2017 related to this marijuana for non-medically prescribed use, which is what the act was called. It doesn't really touch too much on the medical marijuana. There's some references as it has to do with host community agreements or those types of things. But for all intents and purposes, the medical marijuana laws have not been changed since the town adopted its bylaw 3 years ago. So it's kind of where we were is where we are. And no one's ever actually submitted an application to the state for an RMD in Hingham. So it's a piece of it that Hingham hasn't had to deal with yet.
So is the medical marijuana monitoring and regulation much like an opiate prescription, where a medical professional has to essentially write a prescription, like, for example, for Oxycontin or something like that, and thereby there's an accountability on that use, and there's a regulation on that use that's supervised by the professional? Is that kind of the way they control that process and keep the distribution of marijuana within a controlled kind of a community?
Right. Well, I'll do with a caveat that I'm not a medical professional. However, marijuana is not an FDA-approved drug. However, it is required you are required to have a prescription from a medical professional in order to obtain it. And you have to present your prescription, or you have to be a caregiver of someone with a prescription in order to purchase it.
I think you have to register as a patient.
Yes, you have to register as a patient. You have to have a prescription, you have to be registered, exactly. So that is dealt with more as a medical. So could you come up? Thank you.
Bill Fisher, 12 New York Street. To reiterate, yes, you do need a prescription. When I was prescribed in 2015, I did need to register with the state and get a medical marijuana card. With that card, I am able to go to any dispensary to be able to get my prescription, but that, in a sense, is the only regulation. I don't need to go to my doctor every single time to get a prescription, as long as I get that registration through the state.
Thank you.
So with the registration comes accountability, and I'm just thinking out loud relative to the regulation of alcohol. If a package store sells to underage, or a package store sells to someone who basically is involved in a, drunk driving accident, who is impaired, then there's some legal recourse back to the establishment. At least that is how I understand it. I could be wrong. And I'm just wondering, just in terms of accountability, how does any of what's proposed in the diagram in terms of the options, what kinds of accountability pieces would be part of this? Has the state come up with anything on that, or I'm just curious, where is the state in its thinking? It sounds like it's like one of these unfunded entitlements.
On its thinking on?
On the accountability and the regulation and, for
Well,
example,
there's
policing.
there's an extensive licensing procedure, but the communities have a very limited role with respect to that. The municipalities are notified.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Bonner.
Thank you. We'll handle it up here, thank you.
I'm sorry, do you want to, am I answering your question
Yeah.
properly? Okay.
It's the accountability portion. How does
Right.
it go back through the system if a problem occurs, it gets into the hands of children or whatever?
I think there's licensing under the Act, and then there's supposed to be more detail about the licensing process in the regulations, which haven't come out yet. So I'm assuming the state will have enforcement procedures, the same way if someone's selling alcohol to underage. However, there's not, unlike alcohol licenses, which are done at the local level, the licensing for these establishments are going to be done at the state level. So my presumption is that enforcement, unless it's a zoning violation or something of that type, violations with respect to the licenses themselves, we have to handle at the state level. At this point is what our understanding is until further regulations come out.
Okay, thank you.
I just had a quick, I think, clarification question, because I think I'm reading it incorrectly. On the chart and in the presentation, when it talks about the December 31st, 2019 date, that it says, until the 31st of 2019, Hingham may prohibit or limit MEs by the adoption of the bylaw. And then, over here, it says, we can ban MEs, but after December 31st, 2019, a ban will require a ballot vote. So does it reset, and after the 2019, we have to do a ballot vote? Or if we do it before then, we will never have to do a ballot vote?
Yes.
You know what I'm asking?
Yes. The second, if they're banned now and the town keeps them banned,
Okay,
you don't
so
have to do anything else. But if you don't do, right.
2019 date does not trigger anything
Yes, no,
regardless? Okay.
no.
Thank you. I thought that, but when I read it again, I was confusing myself.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so the next step, as we stated before, is to set up a time for our next meeting to obtain more public input, but also to start to talk as a board about where we want to head with this. I know Mary polled the board for availability next week. I mean, our time is short. We have the last week of November, I think we'll be drafting. And then we have the week before that is Thanksgiving. Yeah, so I'm just backing into like why we would maybe want to meet next week.
Correct. So the planning board has to decide what bylaw or bylaws you may want to refer upstairs for inclusion on the warrant. You can do one, or you can do none, or you can do more than one. So to Jen's point, I think it's important for the board to gather your information and then deliberate to provide direction to staff so that we can start working on it, to have something cohesive to meet your desires in order to be voted on November 27th, possibly.
Right.
That's not a lot of time, so
Right.
you're correct.
So next week, I think you said, I know we already have a meeting with a full agenda Monday night, the 6th.
Oh, we do it next Wednesday.
I can't do next
No, I
Wednesday.
The board said the majority of the board was available on Tuesday. We don't have the majority on Thursday. The chairman's not available on Wednesday. I have another meeting Wednesday and Thursday myself. Not that I have to be here, but.
So I didn't have my schedule set. If I did the 9th, is the majority available on Thursday, or is it really a problem to do it on Thursday?
Yeah, Gordon's not
I'm
available.
out. I
Jen's
fly
not
out.
available.
I fly out on Tuesday.
Sarah's not available.
I think we're looking at Tuesday.
So
right?
Tuesday was an option. Now, this isn't a public hearing. There doesn't, we can have it on TV. The other option would be to wait another week, but you have a full agenda again on Monday, the 13th, and then you're really pushing up against Thanksgiving and running out of time to draft something.
Right. So what do we feel about next week?
So it's Wednesday without you, would be the
Or,
question?
no, Tuesday, I think, with me.
Oh.
I could do Tuesday.
Trying to
I'm
do
not
without
sure,
me.
but I think I can.
Not at all.
Just
No,
kidding.
I was ruining the possibility that we might do it.
Wednesday, Thursday, better,
Yeah, but Tuesday, I don't know yet. I think my spouse has a Recreation Commission meeting, but we'll figure it out. I think I can make it.
Okay, thank you. All right, so then the next meeting, it sounds like, will be next
Tuesday,
Tuesday
the
night, the 7th.
Yeah, let's make that, I'll make that
And in the
work.
meantime, like I've said, continue to send in your written comments to Mary or on the website.
And we will make an effort, too, to publicize the meeting. I've had several people tell me that despite our best efforts, that not a lot of members of the public knew about tonight's meeting. So I will make a redoubled effort to try to get the word out, and by all means, I encourage anyone, if you're involved in groups or committees, pass the word so that the board can have the benefit of everyone's opinion.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
We're adjourned. All in favor?
Aye.
Adjourned.
Hi, you guys. I'm the newly hired Hingham reporter for the Patriot Ledger.
Oh, excellent.
I promise I was not like texting and ignoring you. I had computer trouble, so I actually typed that entire story on my iPhone. I was listening.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, feel free to reach out.
Thank you. Thank you.